Here's what military historians won't tell you about D-Day. The entire invasion almost failed before soldiers even reached the sand, and the only thing that prevented total catastrophe was a bunch of weird-looking tanks that every general in the Allied command thought were absolutely insane. Picture this. June 6, 1944, the biggest amphibious invasion in human history, and the difference between victory and a bloodbath came down to one stubborn old man, who everyone said was crazy, building machines that looked like they belonged in a cartoon. His name was Percy Hobart, and this is the story of how ridicule turned into redemption and changed the course of World War II forever. So let's go back to 1942, because that's when this whole thing really starts. The Allies knew they had to invade Europe. They knew Hitler had to be stopped. But there was one massive problem that kept every military planner awake at night. How do you get thousands of men from boats onto a beach when the enemy has had years to turn that beach into a death trap? The Germans weren't stupid. They knew an invasion was coming. They just didn't know where. So they fortified everything. They built the Atlantic Wall, this massive defensive line stretching from Norway all the way down to the Spanish border. Concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, artillery positions, minefields everywhere, underwater obstacles designed to rip the bottom out of landing craft, steel hedgehogs that would impale boats, wooden stakes with mines attached, and behind all of that, thousands of soldiers with orders to shoot anything that moved. The math was simple and terrifying. If you tried to land on a heavily defended beach with conventional tactics, you'd lose so many men that even if you succeeded, you wouldn't have enough troops left to push inland. Military strategists ran the numbers over and over, and every simulation came back with the same answer: unacceptable casualties. Some estimates predicted that up to 70% of the first wave wouldn't make it off the beach. Think about that for a second. 7 out of every 10 men dead or wounded before they even started fighting. That's not a military operation, that's a suicide mission. But they didn't have a choice. Europe had to be liberated. Hitler had to be defeated. So someone had to figure out how to solve this impossible problem. Enter Percy Hobart. Now, Hobart wasn't some fresh-faced young engineer with revolutionary ideas. This guy was old by military standards, pushing 60, and he'd already had a career that was basically one long battle with his superiors. He was brilliant, everyone admitted that, but he was also stubborn, difficult, and completely unwilling to follow orders he thought were stupid. He'd pioneered tank warfare tactics in the 1930s when most British generals still thought cavalry charges were the future. He'd commanded armored divisions in Egypt. He'd written papers about mobile warfare that were way ahead of their time. And his reward for all this innovation? He got forced into retirement in 1940. The British Army basically said, "Thanks, but no thanks. We don't need your crazy ideas. Enjoy your retirement." So there's Hobart, one of the most brilliant military minds in Britain, working as a corporal in the Home Guard, which was basically a volunteer defense force for old men and teenagers. He's literally out there training with broomsticks because they didn't have enough rifles, and meanwhile the British Army is getting hammered by German tanks using the exact tactics Hobart had been trying to teach them for years. But Hobart had one thing going for him. Winston Churchill knew who he was. Churchill had this habit of remembering talented people, even difficult ones, and when he heard that Hobart was wasting away in the Home Guard, he personally intervened. In 1941, Churchill brought Hobart back and put him in charge of the 79th Armoured Division. Now, this wasn't exactly a promotion to glory. The 79th wasn't a frontline fighting force. It was more like a workshop, a place to experiment with new ideas and develop specialized equipment. But for Hobart, it was perfect. He finally had the resources and authority to tackle the beach problem, and tackle it he did. Hobart started with a simple question. What are all the specific ways soldiers die on a beach landing? He broke it down methodically. They die because they can't get off the landing craft when it hits obstacles. They die because they drown in deep water with heavy equipment. They die because they step on mines. They die because they can't get past concrete walls and fortifications. They die because they're exposed to machine gun fire with no cover. They die because tanks can't support them, because tanks get stuck in soft sand or shingle. They die because engineers can't clear obstacles fast enough while under fire. Every one of these problems had killed men in previous amphibious operations. The Dieppe raid in 1942 had been an absolute disaster, with Canadian forces suffering 68% casualties, and all these problems had contributed. So Hobart decided to design a specific vehicle to solve each specific problem. This is where things get weird, because the solutions Hobart came up with didn't look like normal military equipment. They looked bizarre. They looked like something a kid would draw. They looked, frankly, kind of ridiculous. That's why people started calling them Hobart's Funnies. The name wasn't meant as a compliment. It was mockery. Other officers would see these designs and laugh. But Hobart didn't care about looking cool. He cared about keeping soldiers alive. Let's talk about what he actually built. First, there was the DD tank, which stood for duplex drive, but everyone called it the swimming tank. Hobart took a regular Sherman tank and added a flotation screen around it, basically a canvas skirt that could be raised up to give the tank buoyancy, plus a propeller driven off the engine. The idea was that these tanks could launch from landing craft while still in deep water, swim to shore under their own power, then drop the flotation screen and immediately start fighting. Sounds great in theory, right? In practice, it looked absolutely insane. You've got a 30-ton steel box floating on a canvas skirt with just a couple feet of freeboard. If the waves were too high, it would sink like a stone. A lot of officers took one look at this thing and said, "No way, this is suicide. We're not putting our men in swimming tanks." Then there was the Crab, which was a tank with a giant rotating drum mounted on the front. Attached to this drum were dozens of heavy chains. The drum would spin, and the chains would flail the ground in front of the tank, detonating any mines before the tank drove over them. It worked, but it looked completely absurd, like someone had attached a lawnmower to a tank. And it was slow and loud, which meant you were basically announcing your presence to every enemy soldier in the area. Hobart also developed the Crocodile, which was a tank with a flamethrower. Now, flame tanks weren't new, but Hobart's version was different. Instead of carrying fuel inside the tank, which was dangerous, he attached an armored trailer behind the tank that held the fuel. This let the Crocodile carry way more fuel and shoot flames up to 120 yards. The psychological effect was devastating. Soldiers would rather surrender than face a flamethrower. But again, you're dragging a trailer full of explosive fuel behind your tank. If that doesn't sound dangerous, I don't know what does. Then there was the Bobbin, which was designed to solve the problem of tanks getting stuck in soft sand. It was basically a tank that unrolled a carpet. Not a decorative carpet, obviously, but a reinforced mat made of canvas and wood that created a temporary road. The tank would drive forward, unrolling this mat behind it, and other vehicles could follow on the firm surface. Simple idea, but it looked ridiculous in action. There was the fascine carrier, which was a tank carrying an enormous bundle of wooden logs, like a giant stick bundle that was almost as big as the tank itself. When the tank encountered a ditch or crater too wide to cross, it would just dump this bundle into the gap and drive over it. Problem solved. But you've got to imagine what this looked like. A tank with a bundle of sticks bigger than itself, looking like it's about to start the world's largest campfire. The Churchill AVRE, which stood for Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers, was another Hobart creation. This was a tank designed specifically for destroying fortifications. Instead of a regular tank gun, it had a petard mortar that fired a 40-pound bomb called a flying dustbin. The range was terrible, only about 80 yards, and the recoating was so violent it could injure the crew if they weren't careful. But that flying dustbin could demolish a concrete bunker in one hit. The AVRE could also carry different attachments. A bridge that could deploy in 30 seconds to cross a 30-foot gap, or an explosive charge called a goat that could be placed against a wall and detonated remotely. Hobart developed the centipede, which was basically a bunch of metal tubes that could be pushed forward by a tank to create an instant bridge. There was the double onion, which was 2 demolition charges that could be laid against sea-walls. There was the bull-shorn plow, which was another mine-clearing device that used plows instead of flails. Each of these vehicles was designed to solve one specific problem that soldiers would face on the beaches. And here's the thing. Hobart was right about all of them. Every single design was based on real problems identified from real combat experience. But that didn't stop people from thinking he was out of his mind. The mockery was relentless. Senior officers would visit demonstrations and barely hide their laughter. Even Hobart's own staff sometimes wondered if the old man had lost it. The American generals were particularly skeptical. They looked at these weird contraptions and said, "No thanks, we'll stick with conventional tactics and overwhelming firepower." The British tried to convince them, bringing American officers to watch demonstrations, showing them how each vehicle worked, explaining the tactical advantages. Some Americans were impressed, but the top brass mostly said no. General Omar Bradley, who would command American ground forces on D-Day, rejected almost all of Hobart's Funnies for the American beaches. He agreed to take some of the DD swimming tanks, but that was about it. The Americans believed in doing things the traditional way, massive naval and aerial bombardment to soften up defenses, then get men ashore as fast as possible with conventional equipment and accept the casualties. The British and Canadians, on the other hand, decided to go all in on Hobart's designs. They'd learned hard lessons from Dieppe, and they weren't willing to sacrifice thousands of men if technology could save them. So as D-Day approached, you had this weird split in planning. The British and Canadian beaches would have the full suite of Hobart's Funnies supporting the landings. The American beaches would not. Now let's jump forward to June 6, 1944. D-Day, the biggest amphibious invasion in history. 156,000 Allied troops hitting 5 beaches in Normandy. Utah and Omaha for the Americans, Gold and Sword for the British, Juneau for the Canadians. The naval bombardment had been going for hours. Thousands of bombers had pounded the coastal defenses. The sun was barely up. The weather was terrible, rough seas and low clouds. But Eisenhower had made the call. We go. On the British and Canadian beaches, Hobart's Funnies went in with the first wave. Crab tanks flailing the sand, clearing paths through minefields. AVRE tanks blasting fortifications with their petards, dropping bridges over obstacles, laying fascines across ditches. Bobbin tanks rolling out their mats so following vehicles wouldn't get stuck. Crocodile tanks sending jets of flame into bunkers, forcing German soldiers to surrender or retreat. The DD tanks had mixed results because of the rough seas, but where they made it ashore, they provided crucial fire support in those critical first minutes. And it worked. The British and Canadian forces took casualties. Absolutely. This was still a combat operation against a fortified position, but they didn't get pinned down on the beach. They got inland. Gold Beach was secured in a few hours. Sword Beach took longer because of stiff German resistance, but the troops kept moving forward. Juno Beach was tough because the Canadian landing was delayed and they hit the beach at a bad tide, but Hobart's tanks helped them push through. Meanwhile, on the American beaches, things went very differently. Utah Beach actually went pretty well, partly because the troops landed in the wrong place and ended up hitting a less defended section, and partly because the naval bombardment had been effective. But Omaha Beach was a catastrophe. Almost everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The bombing run missed the German positions entirely. The naval bombardment was less effective than hoped. The DD swimming tanks, which were the only Hobart device the Americans used in quantity at Omaha, launched too far from shore in rough seas. Out of 29 DD tanks launched, 27 sank. The crews drowned or barely made it out. Only 2 tanks made it to the beach under their own power. A few more were saved when their launch officer saw what was happening and decided to disobey orders, taking his landing craft all the way to shore before launching the tanks. Without armor support, without mine-clearing tanks, without bunker-busting tanks, the American infantry at Omaha ran straight into intact German defenses. Machine gun fire raked the beach. Artillery shells exploded among the landing craft. Men were cut down before they even got out of the water. The first wave took devastating casualties. Companies landed with 200 men and were down to 50 effectives within minutes. Officers were killed. Communications broke down. Some units lost 80 or 90% of their strength. For hours, the outcome at Omaha was in doubt. There were moments when commanders offshore seriously considered abandoning the beach and redirecting forces elsewhere. Only the incredible courage of individual soldiers and small unit leaders turned it around. Men found gaps in the defenses. Destroyers came in dangerously close to shore to provide point-blank fire support. Slowly, through sheer determination and sacrifice, the Americans clawed their way off the beach and up the bluffs. But the cost was horrific. Omaha Beach accounted for more than half of all Allied casualties on D-Day, even though it was only one of 5 beaches. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing at Omaha. Compare that to the British beaches where Hobart's Funnies operated in force. Gold Beach had about 400 casualties. Sword Beach had about 600. Juno Beach was the toughest for the Commonwealth forces, with about 960 casualties, but that was still dramatically lower than Omaha, and Juno was considered a difficult landing. Now, it's important to be fair here. Omaha was always going to be tougher than the other beaches because of the terrain and the quality of German troops defending it, and there were other factors beyond just equipment that affected casualty rates. But every serious military historian who studied D-Day has reached the same conclusion. Hobart's Funnies made a massive difference. The specialized armor saved hundreds, probably thousands of lives on the British and Canadian beaches. After D-Day, the Americans quickly changed their tune about Hobart's designs. Suddenly, those funny-looking tanks didn't seem so ridiculous anymore. American forces requested and received Crocodile flame tanks for future operations. They adopted the mine-clearing flails. They started using AVRE-type vehicles for assault engineering. All the stuff they'd rejected before D-Day became standard equipment afterward. Hobart himself became something of a legend, though characteristically he didn't care much about the recognition. He kept working on new designs throughout the war, always focused on the practical problem of keeping soldiers alive. His division, the 79th Armoured, continued to support British and Canadian operations across northwest Europe, all the way to Germany. The tanks participated in the crossing of the Rhine, the assault on various fortified positions, basically any operation where specialized armor could make a difference. But here's what really gets me about this story. Hobart was right all along, and everyone should have known it. Everything he designed was based on simple, logical analysis of real problems. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't theorizing. He looked at what had killed soldiers in previous amphibious operations, and he built machines to prevent those deaths. And people still mocked him because his solutions looked weird. There's a lesson in that, I think, about how we evaluate ideas. It's easy to dismiss something that looks unconventional. It's easy to stick with traditional methods because they're familiar and safe. But traditional methods at Omaha Beach meant men drowning in the surf, getting blown apart by mines, pinned down by machine guns, unable to breach fortifications. Traditional methods almost lost the most important battle of the war. Hobart's weird-looking tanks kept soldiers alive. That's what mattered. Not how they looked, not whether they fit conventional military aesthetics, but whether they worked. And they did work. After the war, military forces around the world adopted Hobart's innovations. Modern armies still use flail tanks for mine clearing. They still use specialized engineering vehicles for bridging and obstacle clearing. They still use amphibious armor. All of that traces back to Hobart's work in 1942 to 1944. The man who was forced into retirement, who was mocked for his crazy ideas, who built tanks that generals laughed at, ended up revolutionizing amphibious warfare and saving thousands of lives. Percy Hobart died in 1957 at the age of 71. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't seek publicity. By all accounts, he remained the same stubborn, difficult, brilliant person he'd always been. But the soldiers who fought on Gold, Sword, and Juno beaches knew what his tanks had done for them. The crews who operated those vehicles knew. The planners who saw the casualty figures knew. History sometimes remembers the wrong people. We remember the generals who commanded armies, the politicians who made speeches, the heroes who performed individual acts of valor. All of those people deserve recognition, absolutely. But we should also remember the stubborn engineers who solved problems, who ignored mockery and kept working, who cared more about function than glory. Hobart's Funnies weren't funny at all. They were the product of careful analysis, innovative design, and a determination to value soldiers' lives above conventional thinking. They turned potential catastrophe into achievable objectives. They helped ensure that D-Day succeeded, which meant the liberation of Europe could proceed, which meant World War II could be won. And it all came from one old man who everyone thought was crazy, building tanks that everyone thought looked ridiculous, proving that sometimes the craziest-looking idea is actually the smartest solution. The next time you hear about D-Day, remember, it wasn't just courage that won the beaches. It was courage plus innovation. It was soldiers willing to fight and engineers willing to think differently. It was Hobart's vision proving that mockery doesn't mean you're wrong. It sometimes just means you're ahead of your time. Those rolling carpets and swimming tanks and chain-flailing mine clearers looked bizarre, but they worked when it mattered most, and that's the only measure that counts in war. The difference between success and failure, between life and death, between victory and defeat, sometimes comes down to being willing to look foolish in order to be effective. Hobart understood that. He didn't care what people called his tanks. He cared whether they brought soldiers home alive. And they did. If you want to see what happened next in World War II, check out the next video up here.